I think that a big mistake after the first Trump presidency is that this idea that every statement, every concern of Mr. Trump was a crazy idea. And I think that what it's true is that behind every crazy statement, there is a truth and there is a message that has sense.
Welcome to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm Adam Dixon. Today I'm joined by Roberto Duran-Fernandez, who is professor at the School of Government at Tec de Monterrey in Mexico. He's also non-resident scholar at the Baker Institute at Rice University in Texas. He's an experienced economist with private sector experience, having worked previously for McKinsey, and public sector experience with the Ministry of Finance of Mexico. Roberto, welcome to the New Enlightenment.
It's great to be here, Adam, and it's great to see you again after so many years that we were colleagues in Oxford.
I just want to tell people we're recording on the 11th of February, 2025. Last week, Trump threatened 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada. Within 24 hours, he backed down. So things are moving very, very, very quickly. So by the time this comes out, who knows what the world is going to look like. So, Roberto, tell us what's going on. What's the word on the street in Mexico after the Trump victory and what's been happening in the last month or so?
It's a very, very interesting time for being alive and being involved in these trade discussions. Just to give a little bit of context of to your audience, Mexico signed a free trade agreement with the U.S. in 1994. That changed completely the economy of this country, and it deeply integrated to the North America value chain. It's difficult to think about. If you ask somebody in Europe, they will not think in Mexico like a manufacturing powerhouse. But for example, the top export of Mexico are automobiles, are cars. It's not low tech, and this is part of a very deep integration that not only Mexico but also Canada has in North America. For example, yesterday Paul Krugman posted that there is no such thing as an American or Canadian or Mexican car factory. It's North American, and it's amazing how integrated are these supply chains. Sometimes a component crosses the border 2, 3, 4 times, and this is because of this common trading space that we built as a continent like in 1994. The first Trump presidency in 2008, there was like a big negotiation of this free trade agreement. In practice, it was an update. And actually, there were many things that we didn't discuss in the 90s that had a value after that time. For example, we discussed and we include things about intellectual property that at the time was very important given the things that were happening in China because of theft of property rights. For example, I can say now, we can say that the agreement that we have now in North America is more advanced in terms of intellectual property. If there is theft of intellectual property in Mexico and Canada, actually the country can sue the country, not only the company. So it's really a lot of protection. And there were like many updates that were happening here. Something that happened is that in that trade agreement, it has a very regional view. Actually, there were some caps on the kind of production that you can include and the value and where the value added is generated. And implicitly, it was saying that, and it was forbidding non-North American companies, especially Asian from China, to enter in this value chain. There are like some strict caps on North American value added that has to be, for example, in cars. So actually, this is something that was agreed. It was very interesting because during the campaign, everybody here and also in Canada were we believe that nothing will happen because at the end, Mr. Trump said that this was the best deal agreement ever signed, and actually he said that, and he signed it. And now we see all these changes. I would say that the sentiment is that many people in the private sector, even in the government, they believe that this might be just a reedition of 2008. Trump 2.0 is not very different to Trump 1.1. That maybe there are some specific things that Mr. Trump has in the agenda, and all this bombastic noise is just a way to get those objectives. Many people believe that some things that change are, for example, it's true that there are it's a very difficult relation. We have like a big problem with migration, with thousands of migrants from Central and South America that are crossing Mexico and going into the U.S. And this is a big issue, not only for the U.S., but also for Mexico. So something has to do on that, and maybe this trade is only a negotiation tool to be coordinated in immigration policy. And the other thing is that it's true is that we have in this border also like a big problem with drugs, and something changed since the last Trump, that we have this problem of synthetic drugs. It's not the marijuana, it's not the cocaine. We have these synthetic drugs that are manufactured in the country with Chinese inputs. And the dynamic is very different because you have like small cargo. It's something that do not weigh a lot, do not occupy a lot of volume, so it's very difficult to have control on that. And many people agree that maybe the threats on trade are actually a way to get these objectives. That finally it's a way of securing the southern border. Nobody knows what's going to happen. Nobody knows in the U.S. A couple of weeks ago, I was in D.C. and there were some Republican congressmen from the border, and they say that sometimes they feel that it's the border group against the rest of the country, that they do not know about this conflict relationship. In Mexico, I think that nobody knows what to expect, and I will not say anything about Canada, that I think that 1 month ago, nobody will believe that this thing about the 51 state will be even discussed. So there is a lot of uncertainty, and how I see is that there are some very serious and real political objectives in President Trump's agenda. I think that few people have clarity of exactly what are those purposes, those objectives. In general terms, we can say, for example, migration. But what is the end game? It's very difficult to know. The end game is to stop illegal migration. The end game is to the illegal immigrants that are already in the country. It's very difficult to know that. And I think that we will see this evolution in a couple of weeks. But what it's true, it's that given that Canada and Mexico are the closest neighbors and partners of the U.S., many people also think that Mr. Trump is using Mexico and Canada as an example of what can he do to the rest of his partners, especially in Europe, and he might be sending a message of how his policy might look in the future. So
yeah,
it's very complex, a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah. So just to reiterate what you said, he's picking on the closest neighbors to see what he can get out of them, to say, look what I'm willing to do to our integrated North American production capacity. Look what I can do, what I'll do to Europe or other regions of the world, if he's willing to do that to such close neighbors. You mentioned migration, you mentioned issues of the fentanyl crisis, and you also mentioned China. China being one of the providers of the inputs into the drugs. But let's put the issue of drugs to the side. What do we need to understand about the Mexico-China relationship? And how does that play into this? Because much of what's driving Washington is a concern for of China. And there was issues or worries that, China will use loopholes via Mexico to import automobiles. But you had said, no, there was actually protections where there's inputs that have to be produced in North America, a limited or a minimal number of components. Tell us about the relationship with China. What do we need to know? And is there an issue? Is there something that can shed light on U.S. concerns about China and whether it's valid or not?
I think that it's partially true. Like the concern is partially true. And after the first negotiation of NAFTA during the first Trump presidency, in parallel, the U.S. started imposing the sanction in China. So there were like a big movement in the value supply chains, and there were like a lot of production that moved to the U.S. and especially in the southern states, but also to Mexico. And Mexico started to export a lot to the U.S. because of this movement, and there was a substitution of China versus Mexico. In this part of the world, in both U.S. and Mexico, we call this nearshoring, opposite to the offshoring model, and that's something that happened. And Mexico in this moment is the first trading partner of the U.S. So that's something that It was like a very deep structural change. And on the other side, China started to live with all these sanctions and deepen relation with the Gulf. If we see like the numbers and if we see like the Chinese content in Mexican exports, it's not that large. It's 7%. It grew, or like in 2008, when this movement started, it was 3%. So we can say, well, it's 7%. So it's
3%
not
to
yet.
7%. It's not much,
Yeah.
no.
So in Canada, on opposite, it's around 2%, 3%, and actually decreases. And what we see is that Canada, at some point, they make the decision to decouple from China because of these pressures. Actually, they deepened this decoupling during the Biden administration. And in Mexico, this decoupling didn't happen. And it didn't happen not because we didn't want it or the U.S. didn't want it. But the thing is that I would say that this North American value chain is importing only the necessary stuff from China. And if we are importing that as North Americans, because we are not producing that in North America. It's true that we have a surplus in the U.S. and Mexico has a deficit with the China. And maybe the Mexican deficit, it just mirrors a hidden deficit of the U.S. It's not that we are importing from China, not the U.S., and then we are sending these things to China. The solution are tariffs. Well, if we are serious about getting decoupling from China, maybe we have to build these local industries. And maybe, but if we want to, in Mexico, to decouple from China, we have this industry to be in North America, either in the U.S. or in Mexico, and it's something that might be possible, but not with tariffs and in 6 months. It's a long-term industrial policy plan that has to be implemented. Another interesting thing about Mexico and China, if you compare the involvement in China in other Latin American countries, really the involvement in Mexico is really minor. As you and your audience might know, China has these very ambitious infrastructure plans, the Belt and Road Initiative, and it has a big component in South America. Actually, South American countries, for example, Brazil and Argentina, they are big providers of raw materials, food to China. The logistic network from South America to China pass through the Atlantic, so they have to cross the Panama Canal. That it's a strategic issue for China. So the big game for China in South America is to link it's called the Atlantic coast with the Pacific. And you see all these huge infrastructure projects that have a Chinese component in South America. For example, last month in January, there was this port in Peru, the port of Chancay, that is Chinese investments that actually is linked with a series of roads that connecting the Atlantic coast of Brazil with Peru, and it crosses the Andes. So it's crazy the amount of investment that you have there. Some people say, and I worry because this port eventually could be used as a military base. So if you compare that to the involvement that China has in Mexico, it's really minor. So we have some industries, they are not the owners of strategic infrastructure. The Chinese do not own, are not deeply embedded into as a technological supplier of Mexico. So I would say that this movement of the U.S. is more preventive, and they do not want Chinese to have any further involvement in the country. And an important thing is that this does not come from Trump. This also was a concern during Biden. Some colleagues say that Biden was Mr. Trump with manners, because in terms of industrial policy, it was not very different.
Yeah,
we didn't see all these bombastic and spectacular things. I think that some of the political objectives that the U.S. has towards Mexico and Canada is to deepen the decoupling with China. They do not want to have China in the North American value chain. They do not want China to be a strategic partner in technology. It's easier to have this threat because of the level of involvement that we have. Like 80% of the exports of Mexico goes to the U.S. I think that it's 75% to Canada. So really, whatever says the U.S., either Mexico and Canada has to do that. It's not even that easy in South America, because in South America, for example, Brazil, Argentina, China is the main trading partner. And if the U.S. want to have some influence in South America, maybe they have to use more carrot and less stick.
So your basic argument is that the U.S. needs Mexico and Canada if it's going to be resilient vis-a-vis China.
I think that that's true, and I think that that's economics. Like in this moment, the U.S. is in full employment. If you really want to have like some more industry, you have to decouple from China, you need the 120 million people in Mexico, and that's something And that's the North American integration model. And there are a lot of things that you have to solve. This North American integration didn't work for everybody. And it's true that you have pockets of poverty in Mexico that they never noticed that there was this free trade agreement. As you have in the U.S., and you have the Rust Belt in the U.S., you have the mountains of Oaxaca in Mexico. And these are problems that were not addressed by this free trade model. And it has to be addressed. And they were never addressed. But the problem, and what I see, is that putting tariffs and trying to do these spectacular policies, they will not help to overcome this problem.
So let's look southward, right? You mentioned Brazil, Argentina, both of them have significant trade ties with China. So what then is the view of Mexico looking southward? And again, you had mentioned it earlier with relation to the migrants, right? I mean, when people think of migration from Mexico, actually, it's been a net zero. I think most there's not large waves of Mexican migrants going over the border. Often the ones that are coming, it's from Guatemala, or it's Venezuelans or Haitians coming through, or I read recently it was Indian nationals or Chinese nationals actually going through the Darien Gap. And so there is that southern movement. What is Mexico's foreign policy going southward? And how does that relate to this discussion of North American integration?
I would say that it moves in two levels. In terms of the narrative, Mexico is part of Latin America and we are all brothers, but in practice, it's not true. In practice, Mexico is part of North American bloc, and the ties with Latin America are very weak. That's something that it's a fact. And Latin America, it's very interesting region. First, geography sets up there are like clear limits on what can you expect from Latin America. First, you have two Latin Americas. Like you have the Pacific and the Atlantic, and we already say that you have the Andes in the middle of that. And to join these two Latin Americans, it's very difficult. You need like a lot of infrastructure, a lot of investment. The Pacific, Latin America, Colombia, Peru, China, they are more orientated to the Western Hemisphere, to the U.S. And the other Atlantic, South America, Argentina, Brazil, this Latin America that developed these very, very strong ties with China. And it's interesting because originally these ties weren't with Europe. So you have these different realities and these very different interests. And it's very difficult to have like unified policies, unified trade vision. So it's a split continent. And I think that what we will see in the future, respecting the policy of the U.S. toward Latin America, will have this geographic component. Coming to migration, one of the most important drivers of migration in the last time was Venezuela. And as you know, we have this terrible regime with Mr. Maduro in Venezuela. And there were like a lot of sanctions that they didn't work because Maduro was still there. And what happened is that Venezuela lost like a significant portion of its population. Some of these people went to the U.S. through Mexico, but most of these people also went to South America. And you have like a big migration problem of Venezuelans in Brazil, in Colombia, in Chile, and that's part of the disaster regime that you have with Maduro, and maybe the terrible management that even Mr. Biden has with Maduro, with this sanction that at the end only pressure this immigration. You may have other movements and other things that are driving immigration. For example, in Central America, nobody knows. It's violence, it's climate change. There are many things happening at the same time. I would say that it's a symptom of something deeper, and maybe this symptom also reflects the migration flows that you see in Europe. So this is, I would say that this is part of a bigger problem that we are not seeing completely. And of course, I would say that the U.S. is seeing only the tip of the iceberg of this problem.
Right. So I want to talk about nearshoring as a global phenomenon. How should we understand the potential of nearshoring, but also its limits? And if you could say a bit about, so basically nearshoring is reducing these very extensive global supply chains into closer ties with people that you can trust, basically. And that really came to a head during COVID when people realized China supplies basically everything, and shouldn't we have more resilient supply chains and have things closer to home? Can you just say a bit more about what nearshoring is? Is it working, right? So just to throw out a buzzword, people talk about deglobalization, but then when you start looking at trade statistics, you think, well, actually, there's still a bit of globalization happening. What's the state of nearshoring? not simply just in Mexico, the U.S. and
Yeah.
Canada, but everywhere?
It's a very interesting question. And as you know, like when you and me study economics, we were taught that the only driver of trade was competitive advantage. And if there was an advantage in cost, I should take it. I would say that the main driver of globalization since the beginning of the century was this cost efficiency, this just-in-time model. And that's when we see all these factories and this manufacturing production moving from the Western world, from the U.S., from Canada to East Asia, especially China, when they opened to international trade, because it was economically intelligent to do that. It was efficient. Many things happened, and maybe the first thing that happened, it started at the middle of last decade, in the 2012, 2014, that China was not that cheap as it used to be, and that I think that was the first goal. But then some events started to happen. We started to see some disruptions in the supply chain, maybe starting with the first trade war of President Trump, with COVID. Something that very, very interesting that few people remember is this disruption that we have in the Suez Canal, when the evergreen boat just gets stuck there, and then suddenly all foreign trade collapsing in Europe. And I think that what happened is that the companies start to see that this offshore globalization model was not very resilient, and it was a very fragile economy. And we benefit as a world from this globalization, but this globalization also has some risks. And part of these risks is, yes, if I can put a container in Shanghai to New York in 1 week, well, maybe a virus that started in China can go to the other side of the world in 3 months. And those risks, I think that we were not aware about those risks. How I see nearshoring is that it's a hedging strategy against those risks. And it's not about economic development, it's about generating efficiency, but about generating resilience through diversification of the supply chains. That it has a lot of sense. If you think in terms of finance, in finance, that's the model. I cannot put all the eggs in the same baskets, so I have to diversify. And in terms of manufacturing, we didn't do that. We put all the eggs in the same basket, and that basket was China. And if suddenly Mr. Xi Jinping wants to close the border because there is like this mortal virus, well, all the supply chains get broken. And that's what happened. And this nearshoring idea is what I see, and it's a strategy for global companies to diversify and hedge against that risk. Opposite to finance, if you want to diversify in finance, well, I have to buy different assets. The problem is that here you do not have the asset. You have to build the assets. And building these assets means moving some production from China to Mexico, maybe to Central America, maybe from China to Eastern Europe, to the Middle East. That's the kind of geographic diversification that we are seeing. By definition, you will not see all the factories going out from China and settling in Arizona or Mexico, because that's again this spirit of risk hedging. But you will see this construction, this investment in manufacturing capacity to hedge against those risks. And this is very interesting because this is a framework that it's very compatible with the geopolitical risk that we are living. And it's also something that a very interesting discussion. What we are seeing with presidents, with administrations such as Trump, but not only Trump, for example, the Brexit, we see that these countries are taking some decisions in terms of geopolitical strategy, not necessarily in terms of getting more efficient economy. And this is another risk, and you have to hedge against that risk. Mm-hmm. And you have to understand what is the geopolitical risk exposure of every country. In Mexico, in the last 4 years, you see a lot of investments and a lot of production that move from East Asia to Mexico, and this allows Mexico to become the first trade partner of the U.S. And I would say that the main driver was not the internal things that happen in this country, because nothing changed in this country. Even many commentators say that the institutions and the business climate in Mexico deteriorate in this time. But the geopolitical exposure, once we signed the trade agreement with Mr. Trump, actually could drop a lot. And there are some, it's very difficult to measure that, but there are some geopolitical risk index that show that in the last 4 months, for example, Mexico was among the top 5 countries where geopolitical risk decreased the most. And maybe the strategy that has Mexico in these years was to have a negotiation with the first Trump presidency in order to decrease this geopolitical risk. I think that that's the strategy that this country has to follow in the next months, years, I think that that's the strategy that Canada, that Europe, that partners has to follow. They have to adapt and they have to negotiate with President Trump, whatever he has in his mind. Maybe there are some things that are not negotiable, but they have to sit in the table, and that will allow to reduce the geopolitical risk and hedge against that. And I think that the partners they have to have in mind is that there are other regions in the world where this geopolitical risk cannot reduce, such as China. I will not see China sitting with the U.S. and trying to negotiate some big political objectives that Mr. Trump has to China. So maybe this is the strategy that we have to follow, and the blueprint was set like some years ago. And the outcome of this is to deepen the decoupling of the U.S. and North America from East Asia. And the consequence of that, maybe it's more nearshoring. I don't know. This is a possibility.
So you're saying, just so if I understood you correctly, that there was nothing that Mexico did per se in terms of policy that increased its productive capacity. Companies were making investments in Mexico, irrespective of anything that the Mexican government did in terms of industrial policy or industrial strategy. Companies just looked at the map and they said, it's safer to be in Mexico. We can build factories there. We can move our production. So I guess that for the politicians, though, it says, look at all the jobs we've created. Well, actually, they did nothing. It's the corporates that are making the decision. But to be fair, there was an existing trade agreement, which facilitates it. But that goes to your point that if Trump's ultimate aim, which again, and I just want to stress that, and you mentioned this, it's not, we have to remember that the concern with China is bipartisan in the U.S. It was in the Biden administration, it was in Trump 1, it was in the Obama years as well, or it intensified under the Obama presidency. So not much is necessarily new. And as you mentioned with the shift from NAFTA to the USMCA, it was basically an update that needed to happen and probably would have happened irrespective of Trump because the world changes. But there's still that sense of what's going to happen. So going back to Trump, so clearly the U.S. needs Mexico and Canada if it wants to decouple in a serious way from China. It needs Mexico and Canada if the Monroe Doctrine is of any importance still, and the effort to retain some kind of authority over the Western Hemisphere. No, I shouldn't say authority, but vigilance over China in the Western Hemisphere. So if the U.S. is not neighborly with Canada and Mexico, then how does it expect Mexico or Canada to support looking southward to the rest of South America in terms of their relationship with China? But what do you think will happen? I mean, I know it's not middle of February, but we've seen some ructions. What does Trump really want? Or let's say, what is the word on the street in Mexico? What's the concern? Is there a wild card that we're not talking about, or in the international press about U.S. Mexico trade?
It's very, very difficult to know exactly what he wants, but I think that there are some signals, and I think that it would be very difficult to have a foresight and a vision of an exact vision of how the world would look in 1 or 2 years. But maybe trying to imagine the trends will help. First of all, I think that we have a very good reading of Mr. Trump in many things, and I think that he's a very good communicator. He's a very good politician. And he knows how to move his political base to do things. And I think that this goes against what is in the imagination of the political establishment. And that's why very people are surprised about the things that he are, for example, the things that are now doing with Doge. I think that he's doing a corporate overtake. And if we were talking about a company, those are exactly the steps that you will do today to make a corporate overtake. But the problem is that this is not a corporation, it's a government.
Yeah.
But if you start to see Mr. Trump with this lens, you might understand what he wants. And in terms of international relations and trade, some people say that this is a return of an isolation for the U.S. and actually the U.S. wants to see. And many people are saying, for example, are quoting the increase of tariffs in the 90s and this context in which the U.S. doesn't want to do anything with the world. I think that is totally the opposite. I think really what Mr. Trump wants to say, and he's very explicit about that. He wants to make America great again, and that means to have like a prominent role and do not lose the hegemonic role that the U.S. has in the world to China. And I think that that's the big objective. Exactly how it looks, I don't know. But if you want to do that, I think that there's a very clear playbook that you have to show, and geopolitics say that what are the steps in the playbook. First, you have to secure your internal borders. The southern border, be honest, it's really a mess. And I think that the situation with the southern, it's a sign of weakness of the U.S. because it's not the border between South Korea and North Korea. It's not the Soviet Union and China. It's just raw desert, and you cannot control that. I think that it's a sign of weakness. And you put 10,000 soldiers from Mexico in one side and 2,000 in the other. It's a totally overstatement about the lack of control, of historic control that you have in this border. And I think that this is a clear message that Mr. Trump is saying that I control my country, control my borders. And if you see it in geographical terms, the next thing is that I have control of my region. And I'm an hegemonic power, and I will not allow foreign powers, the Chinese, to come and to take over strategic infrastructure, to go into my supply chain. And I think that that's the end game with Mexico, with Canada and the U.S. I think that the discussion of Canada, I don't know where is this going to end, but it clearly has to do with the Arctic, and it clearly has to do with the new routes that will open.
Yes.
And I don't know how this will end, but I think that this will be a very difficult discussion between Canada and the U.S. about the sovereignty of the Arctic and the territorial waters of Canada in that region. But I think that that's the play that the U.S. wants to do. And after that, you have to build this strong North American region, and then you have to compete against the other regions. And then you have to be sure that China do not get an hegemonic role in the Eastern Hemisphere. And I think that's the duration which Mr. Trump wants to go. He wants to assert this hegemonic role of the U.S. I think that it's very difficult now, for example, to say that the Chinese electronic yuan and these financial initiatives will compete against the dollar. This is not going to happen in the short term.
No.
But I think that the U.S. and Mr. Trump is acting preventively, and they say, well, I do not want to set the conditions for this to be a reality. And if you remember this political narrative of Mr. Trump saying, how did you let China to become this manufacturing powerhouse? And I think that this can apply to some of the things that he are pursuing. For example, he will not allow China to become a financial powerhouse. He will not allow Chinese infrastructure to be predominant, and he will not allow the world trade, the logistic routes to depend on Chinese infrastructure. I think that those are the objectives that he sees. What might happen, I think that we will engage in a very weird, very strange discussion in North America about security, about China, but eventually this is going to settle. And I think that this will settle very soon. Because you cannot engage with China, you cannot engage with Russia, you cannot engage with these big powers if you do not have order and you didn't have a settlement in your region. So I think that Mr. Trump will act very fast, very strong. I don't know exactly the political objective that he has. I think that he's willing to incur in short-term economic losses to achieve his political objectives. And at the end of the day, given the political landscape that you have in North America, his partners, that it's Canada, Mexico, and to some extent Central America, they will agree to some settlement. I think that will happen. It's a dangerous game, yes, because you do not have control of all the players, and you do not know if sometimes you have a miscalculation and then you ask to one of your partners something that they cannot give you.
Yeah.
That puts you in a very unstable, that will happen, and eventually we will stop listening to all this noise in North America, and then the big problem that you have with China, with the conflict with China, the problem with Russia, they will dominate again the agenda.
No, okay. So you said a lot there, and I think I agree wholeheartedly with what you said. I always think, and this has been a narrative for a while over here in Europe, including the UK, where this sense of, the US is becoming isolationist, under Trump. And even you read this in Financial Times columnists. And I always just thought, no, he's not. I mean, I just don't find that you can't make America great again as an isolationist power. And if you look at the moves, the scuffle now with Mexico and Canada about tariffs, which basically was tamped down really quickly, discussions on taking over the Panama Canal, taking over Greenland, saying that Canada is the 51st state. You know, people say naively, they think, oh, this is part of Trump's ego. But actually, if you read underneath what the big concern is, China is, and in the Arctic as well, Russia, the big concern, right? So when we look at the Panama Canal, yes, there's some of these kind of, Trump will say, oh, American shipping is getting a bad deal. We built it, we shouldn't get this. But often the concern is infrastructure on either end that is owned by China or operated by China. That's exactly what the concern is. In Greenland, it's this huge, well, it looks bigger on a map than it actually is, area with 50,000 inhabitants that's part of the Kingdom of Denmark. But, who's protecting it? There's a strategic interest in that. And again, who's controlling the Arctic? It's China and Russia. And Trump's pushback against Canada is about, we need to start looking at the Arctic in a very serious manner. And if we need to take over Canada, I don't think that's going to happen, but it's sending a message. And I think that's the important part about the hubris and the mania of Trump, is it's about sending a message, even if that message comes off in a really shocking manner for a lot of people. But again, I think it's not about this isolationist aspect. And I've said this many times too, when in the previous administration, when threats of leaving the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, talk to Europeans and think, oh, he's going to leave NATO. And I say, America is not going to turn its back on Europe, ever. What America is not going to do is continue to provide security when countries like Germany are not spending hardly anything on defense. Or even in the UK, the military here has been underfunded. And so you look at, and again, why was the concern, why was this Trump pushing for more military spending from NATO, is because they also want to shift their attention to China and to the Pacific, saying to the Europeans, well, okay, you're all rich countries now. It's not World War II anymore. You have an industrial base that can produce military hardware. You can field an army, figure it out so that we can focus on other threats around the world rather than focusing all on European security when the Europeans should do it themselves. So again, I do agree with you. There's that sense of it's not about, you can't make America great, and if it's just inward facing, and it's not very American, I think. But
I totally agree with that, and I think that a big mistake after the first Trump presidency is that this idea that every statement, every concern of Mr. Trump was a crazy idea, and I think that what it's true is that behind every crazy statement there is a truth, and there is a message that has sense, and I think that many politicians were very naive in terms of don't pay attention to those messages, and I think that Mr. Trump and President Trump is kind of an accelerator, and maybe these discussions will happen anyway at some point of time. The discussion of the Arctic will take place at some point, but this is happening now, and I think that that's what is shocking, and few people understand why is this happening. And maybe the strategy of President Trump is to put this in the agenda and to gain some concessions and an equilibrium that is beneficial for the U.S. and maybe for the hemisphere before it's too late and before you have all the Chinese with a lot of ports in the Arctic. And I think that that's what we have to say. And something very interesting and a lesson I think that we have to learn is that you have to take President Trump seriously. And that's something that we didn't do like the last time. And I remember, for example, President Macron, like 1 or 2 months saying, well, we should start building some defense and mutual defense in Europe 8 years ago. And also, yes, that was a clear message, but you didn't did that. And I think that it had to do with the environment that we're seeing. And coming back with economic, with North America, I do not see North America that is totally lose its position to China. I do not see Chinese in a deep position and in a strategic position in Mexico or in Canada. So I think that if the political objective is to have this control and this hegemony in North America, it's something that will happen and will happen relatively easy. And for example, for Mexico, if we do not have a control and a secure southern border, it's because neither country had wanted, and the political will hasn't been there for years. We have these drug dealers because neither the U.S. or Mexico really have been serious about this. If you see like the Mexican army, it can totally crush these criminal groups. But there's so many interests that actually allow these insecurities to come. And I think that, for example, in terms of Mexico, if the condition is you have to secure the border, you have to stop these illegal drugs, you have to have some control of the immigrants, is something that is totally achievable. And once we do that, I think that we can go back to our economic integration and to start discussing how can we decouple as a region from East Asia. Something interesting, and if you compare the two neighbors, I would say that the discussion between Canada and the U.S. will be much more difficult than the discussion with Mexico. Because the discussion with Canada, it will involve, for good or for bad, some discussion about sovereignty in the area. And that will be something very difficult that either the liberals or the conservatives will be keen to have a easy conversation with the U.S. But I want to think that eventually this will settle and we will have this strong North American region. Is that this happened in the last Trump administration?
Okay. So I think we just have to wait for the outcome of the Canadian election, and from the looks of it, the conservative will win and would win big time. And so that might lead to a quick resolution. Going back to what you said about, well, what's happening in North America, it's going to be settled soon because Trump wants that regional integration to then take on the rest of the world. I shouldn't say take on the rest of the world. I think that's a good place to stop our conversation. I will say, just to be fair to China, I don't think China has global ambitions like people think. We should always remember that. I should caveat that in many different ways. But the CCP's concern has always been on internal cohesion of China. And so we have to remember that China is also trying to secure its region in a way that leads to tensions with some of its neighbors. But it's interesting. It's great. I don't want to say it's great to see geopolitics coming back, but it's a different kind of globalization, let's just say. It's not deglobalization. It's a different kind of globalization. I do also think that there is scope for good relations between North America and China. I think there will be, and I think there has to be.
No, I agree, and I think that I have two reactions. Like the first one in respect to China. I don't know. We have this discussion about this rising power, and that inevitably it will get to a conflict, even if China doesn't want. The conditions will be due to that place. And I think that that's like a very scholarly debate about what's going to happen. I don't know, but maybe, I don't know, we want to think like very positively. Maybe these crazy actions and this crazy war in which we're living in this 2025 might prevent this. And maybe this could settle a better alignment and area accommodation with China in this world order. And I totally agree. I do not see China trying to destroy the world order that has enabled China to live, to make better off and to make its population to live poverty in some millions. I do not see the China. But again, maybe this is nothing to the Chinese decision if the political situation evolves in a wrong way. So that's a situation. And my other reaction is in terms of this relation with economic and politics. And it's very interesting because I think that for a long time we think in economics as something that was isolated, like floating in the space, and we do not have to think about anything. But the reality is that economics is not floating in the space. Economic, it depends on institutions, on the legal basis, on politics, on geography. And I think that what happened in the last, I don't know, like 30, 40 years is that this politics, this geography, everything was fixed. So we do not have to worry about that. We can just put attention to profit maximization, utility maximization. That's all because everything was fixed. Ceteris paribus. Everything was ceteris paribus. So we didn't have to worry about that. But now that everything is changing, I will not say that the intrinsic of economics is changing, but I will say that this assumptions where everything is fixed, it's not already there. So if you want to have like an intelligent economic analysis, if economists want to remain relevant, you have to take and you have to have these discussions, and you have to see beyond economics to have a good understanding of what is happening on the world, and maybe we can have a say on what will happen.
That's perfect segue to point to the portrait behind me of Adam Smith, the father, notionally the father of economics, who always thought about the political in addition to many other factors, right? So you've just encapsulated exactly what Smith did when he lived here at Panmure House, and what we're trying to do here now in the 21st century, having conversations with people like you, Roberto, who brings a perspective from Mexico, which I think is useful. Too often debates are Eurocentric or Europe-centric, or it's only just China and Europe, or, and I think it's really important that we have perspectives from different parts of the world. And Roberto, I think it's great to have you, and hope to have you in person here
Thank you very much.
in the not too distant future. Thank you so much, Roberto. You have been listening to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.